The night was strangely quiet. Not even the usual sound of the wind blowing through the tall, old trees around Daniel's house could be heard. Everything seemed frozen in place, as if the world itself had paused. The village, small and peaceful, had slowed to a stop, especially for Daniel. It was as if time no longer mattered to him, as though life had lost its meaning. Since his wife Alice had passed away, Daniel's home had been swallowed by a deep and unbearable silence. It was the kind of silence that made the walls feel as though they were closing in on him, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Daniel lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts circulated in a chaotic dance of grief and loneliness. Alice had been his life. Her laughter had filled the house, her warmth had been a guiding light. But now, her absence had left a void so deep that Daniel feared he would never emerge from its darkness. Night after night, he wept for her. Her illness had been long and cruel, and as she withered away from cancer, Daniel had felt his own soul being chipped away piece by piece. In the months after Alice's passing, his daughter, Sandra, became his only comfort. At 20, she was the spitting image of her mother. The same dark, soulful eyes, the same soft voice that calmed his storm. She took care of him, made sure he ate, and tried her best to fill the gap that Alice had left behind. But as time passed, Daniel found himself drawn to her in a way that felt wrong. At first, he dismissed the feeling, attributing it to his overwhelming grief. But the more he tried to shake it, the more persistent it became. He couldn't deny it anymore. Every time Sandra entered the room, he saw Alice. The resemblance was striking, painfully so. When she laughed, it was as though Alice's voice had returned from the grave. It was during these moments that Daniel felt the boundaries between his memories of his wife and his time with his daughter begin to fade. One evening, as Sandra sat across from him at dinner, Daniel's gaze lingered longer than it should have. She smiled at him, unaware of the turmoil brewing inside her father's heart. She was young, innocent, and entirely unaware of the storm Daniel was battling. The warmth in her smile felt like a cruel reminder of what he had lost. That night, Daniel found himself unable to sleep. His thoughts were plagued by memories of Alice and the way she used to comfort him when life weighed too heavy. His heart yearned for her touch, her voice, her presence. But the more he longed for his wife, the more he found himself staring at Sandra's door. The weeks that followed were a nightmare of confusion and guilt for Daniel. He avoided looking at Sandra directly, yet he couldn't resist the urge to be near her. It was as though Alice had been reborn in his daughter, and Daniel didn't know where to draw the line. He told himself it was just grief, that he missed his wife so much that it made him see things that weren't there. But with every passing day, the line between love for his wife and an unsettling desire for his daughter began to fade. One night, after a long day of restless thoughts, Daniel found himself standing outside Sandra's bedroom door. He didn't know how he got there, but there he stood, his hand trembling as it reached for the doorknob. His mind screamed at him to stop, but his body moved as though possessed by a force beyond his control. The door creaked open, and there she was, sleeping peacefully. She looked so much like Alice that it made his heart ache. Slowly, he walked toward her bed, his eyes tracing the familiar features he had loved for so long. In his twisted mind, he saw Alice lying there, not Sandra. Just as Daniel reached out toward his daughter, Sandra stirred in her sleep, murmuring something soft and unintelligible. He stopped in his tracks, his hand frozen in the air. His heart raced as he realized what he had almost done. Panic gripped him, and he felt a cold wave of horror wash over him. He quickly pulled his hand back and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind him with a loud bang. The rest of the night felt endless. Daniel couldn't find any peace as he paced back and forth in the dark. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, all racing around in confusion. How had things gotten so bad? How had his deep sadness over losing Alice twisted into something so wrong and disturbing? He was filled with shame, regret, and a fear he had never known before. As he sat in the darkness, staring into nothing, he felt trapped in a nightmare of his own making, wishing he could turn back time and change everything. The days that followed were filled with tension. Sandra noticed her father's strange behavior, but she couldn't place it. He was distant, avoiding her eyes, his conversations short and cold. She thought it was just his grief, that he was still struggling to move on. But Daniel was drowning in guilt. He couldn't shake the image of Sandra sleeping, the way he had almost. One evening, while they sat in the small living room, Daniel could no longer hold it in. The silence between them was unbearable, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "Sandra," he started, his voice shaky. She looked up, her eyes filled with concern. "Yes, Papa." He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain what was happening in his mind? How could he tell her that every time he looked at her, he saw her mother? That his love for Alice had somehow turned into something disturbing when he looked at his own daughter? Sandra waited patiently, but Daniel only shook his head. "Never mind," he said, standing up and walking out of the room. The guilt stared at him, but so did the desire. Every time he saw Sandra, it grew stronger. He tried to fight it, tried to remind himself that she was his daughter, not Alice. But the more he resisted, the more Alice's image seemed to merge with Sandra's. One fateful night, Daniel's grief and longing won. It wasn't planned, it wasn't something he had thought through. But in his twisted state of mind, he convinced himself that it wasn't wrong. After all, wasn't Sandra a part of Alice? Wasn't she the living embodiment of the woman he had loved for so long? And so, in the dead of night, Daniel crossed the line he had fought so hard to resist. The consequences of that night would ripple through their lives, and the village, in ways no one could have predicted. The following morning, the house was quiet, too quiet. Sandra sat at the breakfast table, her eyes hollow, her hands trembling as she stared at the untouched food before her. Something had shattered inside her, something she could not put into words. The night before had changed everything. What she once thought was just her father's grief had turned into a nightmare she never saw coming. Daniel couldn't face her. He remained in his room, his guilt and shame choking him with every breath. He had done the unspeakable, and now there was no turning back. His love for Alice, twisted by grief, had driven him to this dark place. And now, he had not only betrayed his daughter, but he had destroyed the only piece of Alice that remained in his life. Sandra knew she had to leave. This place, once a haven of love and warmth, had become unbearable. The walls seemed to close in on her, suffocating her with memories of a father she could no longer recognize. She felt trapped, haunted by the terrible reality of what had happened. But where would she go? The village was small, and news traveled fast. If anyone found out, her life would be over. As the days dragged on, Daniel's mental state deteriorated. His guilt wore him down, growing into a weight that threatened to crush him. He couldn't look at Sandra without seeing the horror in her eyes, without remembering the moment he had crossed a line he could never uncross. His love for his daughter had been twisted beyond recognition, and now, every time he saw her, it was like looking into a mirror that reflected his darkest sins. Sandra, too, was unraveling. She could barely sleep, her dreams filled with the echoes of her father's betrayal. The village women, noticing her very thin appearance and distant demeanor, whispered among themselves. Something was wrong with Sandra, they said, but no one knew what. One evening, when the silence between them had grown too heavy to bear, Sandra finally confronted her father. "Papa," she said, her voice breaking as she stood at his bedroom door. Daniel looked up from the chair where he sat, his face lined with exhaustion and guilt. "Sandra," his voice was barely a whisper. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking at her sides. "What happened? It can't happen again." Her words were like knives, cutting through the thick air between them. Daniel lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. He knew she was right, but the dialysage had already been done. There was no way to undo what had happened, no way to erase the violation, the broken trust. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Sandra clenched her fists, her heart pounding in her chest. "Sorry isn't enough," she whispered, her voice thick with pain. You destroyed everything, Papa." Daniel's chest tightened as he heard the raw agony in her voice. He wanted to reach out to her, to beg for forgiveness, but he knew it would never be enough. There was no way to take back what he had done. He had crossed a line that could never be redrawn. As the days passed, the tension between them only grew worse. Daniel became a prisoner in his own home, too ashamed to face Sandra, too broken to leave. His thoughts sank deeper into darkness, and soon, even the image of Alice in his mind began to fade, replaced by the horrifying reality of what he had done to his daughter. One night, unable to bear the weight of his guilt any longer, Daniel left the house without a word. He walked through the empty village streets, his mind a whirlwind of grief and regret. The shadows seemed to stretch out before him, pulling him toward the edge of the village, toward the river where he and Alice had once shared quiet moments of peace. As he stood by the water's edge, Daniel could hear Alice's voice in his mind, soft and comforting, as it had always been. But her voice now was distant, a memory blurred by the overwhelming shame that consumed him. He knew what he had to do. There was only one way to atone for what he had done. Back at the house, Sandra suddenly woke up, her heart racing. Something felt off, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. A chill of unease settled over her chest, making her feel heavy with worry. Without giving it a second thought, she jumped out of bed and hurried out of the house, her feet instinctively leading her toward the river. When she reached the water's edge, she saw her father standing there, staring into the dark depths. Her heart pounded in her chest as she called out to him, "Papa. Stop." Daniel turned, his face a mask of sorrow and regret. "Sandra," he said, his voice hollow. I can't live with what I've done." "No." Sandra's voice cracked as she ran toward him. "Don't do this." But Daniel had already made up his mind. He took a step toward the water, his body trembling. "I destroyed everything," he whispered, his eyes wet with unshed tears. I don't deserve to live." Sandra's heart shattered as she reached for him, but it was too late. With one final glance at his daughter, Daniel stepped into the river's icy embrace. The water swallowed him whole. Sandra stood frozen, watching as the man who had once been her father disappeared beneath the surface. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a cry of anguish, Sandra fell to her knees, the weight of her grief crushing her. The man who had raised her, the man who had loved her, was gone. But so too was the man who had betrayed her, leaving her alone to pick up the shattered pieces of her life. In the days that followed, the village mourned Daniel's death, but Sandra remained silent. She knew the truth, the dark secret that had led her father to his end. And though she was free of him now, the scars he had left behind would never fade. As she stood by the river, watching the water flow past, Sandra made a vow. She would never speak of what had happened, not to anyone. The shame and the pain would be hers to carry, alone. But the shadows of her father's actions would follow her, haunting her every step, a reminder of the blurred lines between love and obsession, and the devastating consequences of unchecked grief.